Today is April 6th. The deadline is today.
At 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight, Trump's latest ultimatum for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz expires. And this time, the language has been unlike anything we have heard from a sitting American president in modern memory. On Sunday, Trump posted on Truth Social, Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the strait or you'll be living in hell. He signed off the message, Praise be to Allah. Iran's response was equally unambiguous. The IRGC's Joint Military Command posted its own statement, saying that if civilian facilities in Iran are struck, the responses will be more forceful. And a senior advisor to the new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, went a step further, threatening to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as well, the narrow passage connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden.
That is the route through which goods enter and exit via the Suez Canal. Closing both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb simultaneously would constitute the most severe maritime disruption in the history of modern trade. That threat was not an accident. It was a carefully calibrated signal. And understanding why Tehran issued it today, of all days, tells you more about where this conflict is heading than anything else that happened over the weekend. Before we get to the strategic analysis, let us account for what has actually changed in the past 24 hours. In Iran's Haifa strike overnight, a ballistic missile carrying a cluster bomb warhead hit a 7-story residential building. 2 bodies have been recovered. 2 more people are still missing under the rubble. The Israeli Home Front Command confirmed it as the most severe single strike on the city since the war began.
Iran fired multiple additional salvos at central Israel during the night. Tel Aviv, Netanyahu, Petah Tikva, with at least 2 people wounded by cluster bomb fragments in Petah Tikva and 4 more lightly hurt in the Haifa area. The cluster munition dimension of this war deserves direct attention because it is being systematically undercovered. Iran has now used cluster bomb warheads on ballistic missiles in multiple confirmed attacks throughout this conflict. Human Rights Watch documented at least 3 separate cluster munition strikes in March alone, killing civilians near Tel Aviv and wounding dozens more. The UN reports that in recent global conflicts, civilians accounted for 93% of all cluster munition casualties. Iran is not a signatory to the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions, which bans their use. Neither, for that matter, is the United States, which has its own documented history with the weapon. But the operational significance here is important. Roughly half of the ballistic missiles Iran is firing toward Israel are now carrying cluster payloads, according to Israeli military assessments. These are not precision weapons. They are area denial weapons being fired at one of the most densely populated coastal strips in the world. Each one that detonates leaves behind unexploded bomblets that remain live for years. Meanwhile, in Kuwait, a country that has maintained a non-combatant posture throughout this entire conflict, an Iranian strike on April 5th hit a power and water desalination plant, taking 2 electricity-generating units offline. This was the second confirmed hit on Kuwait's water network within days. Kuwait derives roughly 90% of its drinking water from coastal desalination. The country has not joined the U.S. military coalition. It has not fired a single shot. And Iran is striking its water supply. Iran denies responsibility and blames Israel, without evidence, in what analysts have described as a transparent information operation designed less for Kuwait's benefit and more to sow distrust between Gulf states and Washington. The pattern is now documented across 3 countries and 37 days. Iranian targeting has moved through a clear 3-phase escalation. Phase 1, U.S. and Israeli military installations. Phase 2, energy infrastructure, refineries, petrochemical plants, pipelines. Phase 3, which began in early March, civilian survival systems, desalination plants, and power grids. What Iran is doing, systematically, is raising the human cost in Gulf Arab states to a level at which those governments are forced to pressure Washington to stop, regardless of their private preferences about Iran's future. Now, the IRGC Navy has issued something even more significant than another missile strike. On April 5th, the IRGC posted that it is completing operational preparations for what it called Iran's declaration plan for the new Persian Gulf Order. That phrase, the new Persian Gulf Order, is the most consequential statement Iran has made since the war began, and almost no one in Western media is unpacking what it actually means. Think about what the phrase signals. The existing Persian Gulf order, the one that has governed this region since the 1970s, is based on the principle of freedom of navigation as defined by international law, enforced first by British naval power and for the past 5 decades by American power. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, is the physical manifestation of that order. American carrier strike groups in the Gulf have been the guarantor of the strait's openness for 2 generations. When the IRGC says it is preparing a new Persian Gulf order, it is not just talking about blocking tankers.
It is asserting a permanent, institutionalized Iranian role in governing who transits the Gulf, under what conditions, and at what price. Earlier reporting confirmed that Iran has already floated the idea of charging a transit toll, as much as $2 million per passage for ships it chooses to allow through. The IRGC's language suggests this is not an improvised wartime measure. It is the early framework of a post-war regime in which Iran positions itself as a co-administrator of the world's most critical energy corridor. Whether or not Iran survives this war militarily to implement such an order is a different question. But the intent is now visible, and it reframes the entire diplomatic situation. If Iran's end state is not just survival, but a formalized claim over Gulf transit, then the gap between what Washington will accept and what Tehran is building toward is not a negotiating difference. It is a structural incompatibility.
Now here is where the deadline calculus gets genuinely complicated. Behind the public ultimatums and expletive-laced social media posts, mediated talks are continuing. Egypt's foreign minister has been on the phone with both U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian foreign minister Araghchi. Pakistan says it has conveyed to Tehran that Islamabad supports all de-escalation efforts. Oman's deputy foreign ministers and Iranian counterparts met over the weekend to discuss visions and proposals for smooth transit through the strait. And according to reporting from the Times of Israel, Washington and Tehran are in mediated talks for what is described as a 45-day truce, though sources familiar with the discussions say the chances of a deal are slim. Notice what a 45-day truce would actually mean on the calendar. 45 days from today puts the endpoint in late May. That is after the worst of the spring planting season's fertilizer demand peak. It is before the U.S. midterm election cycle fully consumes domestic politics. And it is long enough for both sides to rebuild negotiating positions without either declaring a loss. But there is a reason the chances are described as slim rather than promising. The fundamental problem is not procedural. It is not about which city hosts the talks or which third party carries the messages. The problem is that both sides have publicly committed to positions that are mutually exclusive, and walking back from those positions without losing face is nearly impossible for either leadership. Trump has said he will destroy every power plant in Iran if the strait is not open by tonight. If tonight passes and the power plants are still standing, Iran will read it as the latest in a series of empty ultimatums, and will be correct to do so. But if Trump does strike Iran's power grid, the humanitarian consequences will be severe enough to produce international condemnation at a scale that even allies will find difficult to absorb. And Iran has promised escalation against Gulf infrastructure in response. Amnesty International has already called the threat to bomb power stations a commitment to commit war crimes. Iran, for its part, has told its domestic audience that the strait will not reopen until Iran is compensated for the war, not until the fighting stops, not until a deal is reached, until reparations are paid. That is a position from which no Iranian official can retreat publicly without political humiliation, and in a system where the new supreme leader has not yet made a public appearance and where the IRGC is the dominant institutional power, political humiliation can be existential. So we have a war where neither side can publicly take the exit it privately may need. That is not a recipe for a negotiated solution. It is a recipe for a face-saving formula disguised as a deal, which is precisely what a 45-day truce would be. There is one more development today that received remarkably little attention given its potential significance: North Korea. South Korea's National Intelligence Service briefed lawmakers this morning that Pyongyang is showing no signs of supplying Iran with weapons or war-related materials. The NIS assessment is that North Korea is deliberately staying out of the conflict, likely to preserve the possibility of dialogue with the Trump administration. Kim Jong-un has not sent a condolence message over the death of Ali Khamenei. He has made no public move toward Iran despite years of building a partnership with Tehran and explicitly embracing the framework of a new Cold War against Washington.
North Korea's absence matters because it closes one of the potential escalation pathways that analysts feared most at the start of this conflict. Had Pyongyang begun supplying Iran with advanced ballistic missile components or additional warheads at scale, the military picture inside Iran would look different today. That pipeline appears to be closed, not because of goodwill, but because Kim has made a calculation that his strategic interests are better served by keeping a door open to Washington than by doubling down on an Iranian bet that is increasingly looking like a losing one. China remains the more complex case. Beijing continues to condemn the strikes publicly, but China's behavior, not its statements, suggests a government managing its exposure rather than actively intervening. Chinese cargo flights into Iran have stopped. Chinese tech firms with Gulf data center exposure are quietly assessing the damage to Amazon Web Services and Oracle installations and hardening their own regional infrastructure. And Chinese diplomats are working the phones with European and Gulf counterparts not to stop the war, but to ensure that when it ends, Beijing is positioned as the broker of whatever comes next. The geopolitical realignment happening in the background of this conflict is moving faster than the fighting. And when the shooting stops, whenever that is, the map of who has influence in the Gulf will look meaningfully different from the map that existed on February 27th. So where does this leave us tonight, at the moment the deadline expires? The most likely outcome remains what it has been for the past 3 weeks: another extension. Trump has set this deadline before. He extended it the first time because Iran gave him ships, allowing a handful of oil tankers through. He extended it the second time, citing unspecified, good and productive conversations. On Fox News on Sunday, he said there was a good chance of a deal by Monday. That language, a good chance, is not the language of a man planning a massive infrastructure strike in 24 hours. It is the language of a man looking for a reason to pause again. But here is what is different about tonight from every previous deadline. Each extension has a cost, and that cost is not paid in money or in military assets. It is paid in deterrence credibility. Every time a red line is drawn and not enforced, the next red line starts out weaker. Iran has now watched 3 deadlines pass. Its military planners are calibrating their actions against the assumption that the 4th will pass too. That assumption shapes the IRGC's posture. It shapes what Tehran is willing to offer in mediated talks. It shapes how hard Iran is willing to push on Gulf desalination plants and cluster bomb strikes on Israeli cities. The credibility problem is not abstract. It has concrete operational consequences. And at some point, whether tonight or in the next cycle, the gap between what Trump threatens and what he does will either close violently or collapse into a negotiation that gives Iran far more than Washington intended to concede. That is the real deadline tonight, not the one posted on Truth Social. The deadline on credibility itself. The pieces are still moving. The clock is still running. Come back tomorrow.